When I stream, I often get asked, "Hey Justin, what deck should I play?" Or, "Hey Justin, what's good in Vintage right now? What does Vintage look like right now?" So today I want to make a quick video to go over the decks you're likely to see in a mid-2020 Vintage metagame and the basics on how those decks work. Most Vintage decks fall under 5 major categories. There's the Mishra's Workshop decks, which power out artifacts faster than normal. There's the blue Cantrip decks, sometimes called Xerox decks. These decks use Preordain and other cheap blue spells to fuel powerful Delve and other restricted blue cards, and then basically bury your opponent in card advantage. There's the Bizarre decks. These decks want to flip their library into their graveyard and utilize free spells and creatures to overwhelm opponents. There's the Deathrite decks. They want to use Deathrite Shaman to play permanents ahead of curve while still locking their opponent's mana with cards like Wasteland. And then there's the combo decks. These decks want to chain together a bunch of spells and win in a single turn. The Mishra's Workshop decks typically come in two sub-archetypes. There's the aggro decks. These decks are playing cards like Arcbound Ravager, Foundry Inspector, Walking Ballista, present a really fast clock, while still restricting the speed of your opponent with cards like Sphere of Resistance and Phyrexian Revoker. The Prison Workshop decks look more like controlling decks. They are using wastelands and sphere resistances to continually lock your opponent from casting spells. They use cards like Golos to find these wastelands and Crucible of Worlds to regrow their wasteland every turn, basically locking the opponent out of playing the game. The blue Cantrip decks, the Xerox decks, come in a variety of flavors. This is because the shell can facilitate many ways to win, many ways to play the game. So while all of the decks typically play max number of preordains and the restricted blue cards like Dig Through Time, Treasure Cruise, Gush, the ways they choose to win typically revolve around what colors they choose to play. So a Rug or Teamer style deck might play a bunch of Planeswalkers like Wrenn and Six, Stack Faden, Oko, while a Jeskai deck might try to win with Monastery Mentor, Dreadhorde Arcanist, or you might even take a different approach and use this preordained shell to play more of an aggro tempo style, like a blue-red Sprite Dragon deck. The Bizarre decks also come in two different archetypes. There's the Dredge decks. These decks are trying to flip their graveyard over as quick as possible. They want to put powerful Dredge cards like Golgari Grave Troll and Stinkweed Imp into their yard to change draw 1 into draw 5 or 6. Then they use free spells and creatures that come back from the yard for free to basically bypass the mana system in Magic. These decks are quick, and they will quickly put many zombies into play and run over their opponent. Second archetype of Bizarre decks are the Vengevine decks. Since the introduction of Hollow One to the metagame, a 5 mana creature that essentially becomes a 0 mana creature after you've activated a Bazaar of Baghdad. These decks try to combine the Hollow One with Vengevine and other low cost or free creatures like Basking Rootwalla or Memnite or Stonecoil Serpent to trigger Vengevines from your graveyard very early in the game. These decks sometimes play a aggro or a tempo style. There's a black-green version that's more of an aggro with lock pieces deck and cards like Hogak to be incredibly fast. And then there's a more tempo-oriented style called Hollowvine, which is playing a bunch of free counter spells like Force of Will, Force of Negation, Mindbreak Trap, to protect its Hollow Ones and Vengevines and try to play almost a Delver style strategy. Another major archetype are the combo decks. These decks can vary with how they want to execute their combo, but typically they play a chain of spells and then win in a single turn. One of the main proponents of this kind of style of Magic are the Paradoxical Outcome decks, sometimes called PO. These decks are utilizing the power of the Moxen, Mox Sapphire, Mox Jet, Mox Ruby, as well as Mox Opal, to play a bunch of free 0-drop mana sources that they will then pick up with their Paradoxical Outcome, drawing cards as they go, and then you play them again for free, netting you mana. You chain one paradoxical outcome into another paradoxical outcome, and you eventually will draw all your decks, and the ways you win after that. Sometimes there's a Monastery Mentor and a Time Walk, sometimes there's a Tendrils and a Storm Kill. The kills vary, but the idea is you're going to pick up your Moxen, put your Moxen back down, and draw a bunch of cards while you're doing it. A similar deck is the Dark Petition deck, or the DPS decks. These decks are trying to use Dark Ritual to make a bunch of black mana by casting spells, and then they typically search for a card like Yawgmoth's Will, which lets them play those spells again, eventually ending in Tendrils of Agony, Stormkill, where it all happened in one go. Opponent net 10, 12 spells in one turn, and then they died with the combo Stormkill. Another way to combo with Dark Ritual is the Doomsday deck. This deck has really risen to popularity since the printing of Thassa's Oracle, and this deck sometimes casts even a turn 1 or turn 2 Doomsday utilizing Dark Ritual, and the combo ends up being, if you have a draw card after your Doomsday, you draw into a card like Ancestral Recall or Gush, which will draw you into a Black Lotus and then a Thassa's Oracle. By the time you cast Thassa's Oracle, you have less than 2 cards left in your library, and the Thassa's Oracle trigger will instantly win you the game. The fifth and final major archetype in Vintage are the Deathrite decks. These decks can be either Sultai, also known as Bug, or 4-color. These decks typically are playing a controlling or mid-range strategy, where they're using Deathrite Shaman to put in permanents that will help you grind out a game. Cards like Sylvan Library, Leovold, Oko. These typically hard to cast or, higher mana cost permanents for Vintage. Deathrite helps you accelerate and play those early, while still being able to play cards like Wasteland to restrict your opponent's mana, and you counters like Force of Will to stop the opponent from being able to deploy their strategy. The 4-color option here provides you with cards like Lightning Bolt and Pyroblast, which give very specific answers, as well as engine cards like Dreadhorde Arcanist, which will let you flash back these Lightning Bolts and Preordains and those kind of cards. I've made a list of a few major archetypes that don't really fall in the 5 categories. Some of the ones you may see in a tournament include Oath of Druids. Oath can be a control deck or a combo deck, and their plan is to play the card Oath of Druids, and if their opponent has creatures, or they make their opponent have creatures, Oath of Druids on their upkeep will flip until they find a creature. They only play 2 creatures in their deck, typically 2 of the most powerful creatures you can possibly find in Magic. Sometimes Emrakul, sometimes Griselbrand, sometimes Niv-Mizzet. There's a lot of different ways you can build your Oath Shell, but the end-all be-all is you're going to flip into a very large, very powerful creature. There's the Eldrazi decks. These are the most aggro of the Vintage decks you'll find, typically paired with white to play tax effects. Cards like Thalia or Glow Rider, which make your opponent's spells cost more, will slow them down as you attack them with large spaghetti monsters like Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher. And then there's a new combo Xerox deck being played now, Underworld Breach. It doesn't fall cleanly in either the combo or the Xerox category, so it kind of gets its own spot. This deck can play a control deck, or it can just kill on one turn. That's what makes it really powerful. It gets to use Preordain and all the restricted blue cards, and it could certainly outdraw you and beat you by just having more action than you. Or it can use cards like Demonic Tutor and Vampiric Tutor and Intuition to find its combo pieces and kill you in one turn. This combo typically involves the card Brain Freeze, which puts cards in your graveyard, as well as Black Lotus, so you will eventually mill over your graveyard and then mill over your opponent's graveyard, in which case they will then draw out before you. And that represents most of the major decks you'll find in Vintage. However, it definitely is worth noting that Vintage is obviously the largest card pool in Magic, and every so often someone is going to find some kind of crazy or quirky strategy that maybe is broken and no one had any idea. So you always have to be on the lookout for decks like that. Who knows, sometimes even the most innocuous uncommon printings from standard legal sets might spawn a new archetype. Hopefully this video helps some of you figure out what's going on in Vintage, maybe what deck you'd like to play. I stream on Twitch under I'm Actually Level 1, and all my videos get posted on this YouTube channel. So if you want to learn how to play certain decks, see what's happening before you start to play, I think this is a great place to really immerse yourself in Vintage. So if you feel like that might be for you, please like and subscribe to this channel, and I hope to see you on a Twitch stream or a YouTube video in the future. Thank you.